president of Liftport Group. I'm going to tell you all about that in a minute. But before we get started, I just want to say I'm excited about our show tonight. We've gotten some useful, candid feedback, and apparently we're kind of boring. So we're going to try to spice up our show a little bit. We're still going to cover all the things that we have been covering, but we're going to try to spice things up a bit. So with that, I'm going to make our intros shorter, our outros shorter, give us more time for Q&A, and we're going to try some visuals. We're going to try some visual aids, which we haven't done before. So wish me luck. There's a little bit of there's a couple things we're experimenting with on today's program. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. We're Liftport Group. We've been doing work in the space industry for nearly 20 years. Started out under NASA's Institute for Advanced Concepts Research project on the space elevators. So we tend to work on big ideas in space. We moved away from the Earth elevator and now focused on the lunar elevator. But that's not what our show's about. Our show, Better Futures and Dare Greatly, is kind of an offshoot of what happened during the pandemic. We wound up in a position where we were running a bunch of conferences, online, digital, virtual conferences, almost 30 of them, more than 500 guests, more than 400 hours worth of YouTube content. So that was kind of our contribution to the world during the pandemic, and that's what kind of kept our company afloat. Now, where we're at now is we're getting back into the work of working on the lunar elevator. At the same time, concurrently, we're continuing with our Better Futures space media brand, where we're continuing to work on conferences, and now we're doing podcasts as a service. So love having you along for the ride. This has been super fun. The last couple of weeks, mostly it's been me and the rest of my team hosting various parts of this show. Starting next week, we get back into our regular feature of having some of the movers and shakers in the space field on as guests, because the core of the show is focusing on the intersection of space, but the intersection of space with money, space with policy, space with commercialization. And so we've got Peter Garrettson coming in about a week. He was pretty instrumental in the background of creating U.S. Space Force. He works at a big think tank group out in Washington, D.C. now, and he is often the voice of reason in many important space policy documents, especially the Space Industrial Base meeting documents. And then on Monday, we've got Sean Mahoney. Sean has been in this field for 2 decades, just about. I only started to get to know him about 3 years ago, when he was the president of Maston Aerospace. Recently was purchased by Astrobotic Technologies. Astrobotic is going to the moon pretty soon. And so that's a pretty big move. So we're going to talk about that. He's not with Maston or Astrobotic now, so we're going to talk about that quite a bit. He's also the president of the Space Frontier Foundation, and it has been said many times, and I agree, that Space Frontier Foundation is maybe the reason why we live in the world that we live in. They were the first, most vocal, certainly loudest folks arguing for the commercialization of space. So terrific guests coming up soon. And we have finally finalized our schedule for our Dare Greatly conference. We're going to host a virtual conference at that convergence of money, space, policy, and capitalization. So definitely join us for that. That's going to be the end of March. I'll post links to that in a moment, but we'd love to have your participation and attendance because I think it's going to be a pretty big deal. I mean, fingers crossed. All right. With that, let's talk about space policy. We're only going to spend a couple minutes on why, but we've had some feedback, and really we appreciate the feedback. We're trying to take that for what it is, constructive feedback that makes us think and make this program better. So we took one of the reasons that we look at policy is that federal policy, U.S. national policy, is arguably the biggest catalyst in the space sector. Lots of people want to do lots of things in space, but unless and until it comes down through the policy process, there are no programs of record. There are no RFPs and RFQs. There are no big programs like the James Webb Space Telescope or commercial crew to the International Space Station, or for that matter, the International Space Station constructed at all. So this policy stuff that we do here, I'm told it's pretty dull, and I agree. I actually agree. It can be pretty hard to follow. But there's processes that make this important and valuable. So that's why we spend all this time in policy. And usually it kind of works something like this. And I've been involved with several policies. I want to be very clear about that. I've been deep, far back in the background of creating some national policies. And it kind of looks something like this. Somebody hosts a meeting. We're going to take, for example, the Space Industrial Base meeting, which happens every year around May. It's invitation only. It's hard to get into. It's kind of important. And there you're going to have 100, 150 people. They're going to meet virtually and they're going to meet in person. If it's in person, it's in New Mexico. And they're going to talk about the status of the industrial base of America's space programs. And they're going to talk, and there's going to be an agenda, and they're going to talk about different elements. And one of them might be power, right? Energy in space. And there was a phrase that came out of it, maybe it was 3 years ago, that says power in space equals power, like might, in space. And there's ideas out there called maneuver without regret, and being able to go where you want, when you want, how you want, through, to, and from space. And it all comes down to energy. And there's a lot of conversations about that. But from that, I don't know, that was probably 6 hours worth of conversation out of a 2-day meeting. So that was probably, I would say 25% of that particular meeting was talking about power in space. And they'll talk about other things. They'll talk about logistics. They'll talk about supply chain. They'll talk about advanced technology. They'll talk about security implications, right? So there's all these folks sitting together, and these are people who have honest, legit skin in the game at a national and sometimes international level. These are not rando people. These are folks that kind of have earned a seat at the table. And I have earned a seat at the table because I'm an outlier. I tend to come up with the ideas that other people aren't necessarily thinking about. So I've always been very humbled by my role there. Because frankly, if you're talking about, big ideas like space elevators and space-based solar power and on-orbit manufacturing and space stations, you're sometimes the weirdest guy in the room. So It's fun. It's really fun to kind of throw in these thought grenades that kind of take unexpected roles. So I had nothing to do with this next piece, but one of the things that came out of that, power in space means power in space, is that this got turned into a report, the Space Industrial Base report. I think it was 2019, perhaps. And from, sorry, no, it was absolutely 2020. I'm sure of that. From that, so I have the meeting in May, but they won't finish the report and write it until September, October, or November. So they take about a year to take the ideas from that meeting, vet, evaluate, prioritize, and then those things become a document. They call that a cover document. And it gives all of the federal agencies room to maneuver. And then that becomes sometimes that parts of that, not the whole document, but parts of that become federal policy. And once it becomes federal policy, then it goes through, and any organization that has SBIR, Small Business Innovative Research, I'm gonna post those links. Absolutely, just give me a second. I'll do the chat here overlay. All right. So everybody who posted a moment ago, Doug, appreciate you being here. All of the links, all of the posts that you just did, I only just turned on the chat overlay, so they're not up. But if you post some other stuff, we're happy to have you. Thank you. Your comments are useful. Thanks. Appreciate that. Anyway, but yes, I'll post a lot of these links in a second. I'll be doing some posting when Rachel takes over, so just give me a few minutes on that. Anyway, so these documents, they turn into federal policies, and once they're federal policies, in this case, the Department of Energy, DOE, takes like 3 paragraphs of this industrial base meeting, and they say, okay, we're going to issue some SBIRs and STTRs. Those are Small Business Innovative Research grants and Small Business Technology Transfer grants. And then, hundreds of thousands of dollars times maybe a dozen, maybe 2 dozen, $150,000, $250,000 grants goes out into university, into small business, and then companies bid on doing research. Some of them win, most of them don't. It's about a 1 in 4 chance of winning one of those awards. And then those companies that win go on to build and build and build. And what happens is you get a company like Safe Nuclear up here in Seattle. They're building nuclear power plants the size of a trash can size nuclear power plant. And yeah, it's going to go to homes and power local neighborhood grids, but it's also going to go to space. So that's how this stuff happens. A lot of smart people thinking about it. Then it gets turned into a paper. Then it gets turned into a national policy. Then Department of Energy, Department of Defense, NASA, and NOAA, Department of Education, they all take pieces of these documents and say, okay, how does this apply to our organization? Department of Commerce comes in and assigns stuff to NASA. So how does this happen? And so that's why we spend all of this time in working on policy. Okay, so I know that's a long answer, but really wanted you to understand that. And with that, I'm gonna post a couple things. So just hold a second on that. I'm gonna post a couple documents. And then I'm gonna turn it over. While I'm doing that, I'm gonna turn it over to Rachel. Now, not everybody here knows Rachel. So I'm gonna give a brief, I'm going to let Rachel give a brief introduction. Rachel's been on our team for only a few months, mostly been in the background, and has been writing a bunch of stuff on our Better Futures blog. So definitely catch her shows. What she's been doing has been writing about the guests that we have. By the way, Doug, we've got yours. I think yours is posted, so I'll make sure I post that link too. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel while I bring a bunch of links up. So we have something pretty unusual. And again, think about policy. Think about what I just said about policy when Rachel brings up her pretty unexpected topic. So she's going to talk for just about 5 or 6 minutes, 7, 8 minutes on this. And then we're going to jump into a larger document from the Aerospace Corps. So this is out of character for Liftport. It's out of character for Better Futures and DareGreatly. But I want you to understand it's within the context of why policy matters. So, Rachel, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. So I will introduce myself briefly. I've been working with Liftport for about 2-3 months, but I actually am an investigative journalist, and I previously worked for a company that was owned by a defense analysis agency. So defense analysis is a branch of U.S. defense that uses data intelligence, those type of things, to research war zones and fact check and verify and do ballistic reports. So this is relevant to what I'm talking about. Recently, I'll see if I can pull it up real quick. Michael, did you share the link?
Yeah, I'm working on it now. Go ahead. Go ahead.
When Michael shares the link, Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a 2022 annual report on what's called unidentified aerial phenomenon. Now, when I say that, it sounds like I'm talking about space aliens, right? It sounds like we're talking about UFOs and unidentified flying objects. But when you bring it back to defense and the interests of national defense, unidentified anomalies refer to assets. They refer to the machines of war. So what a defense analysis agency will do is when they go in to fact check a war zone, they will test the ballistics. They'll find, like, when you see a crime scene on TV, someone shoots a gun, they have to identify what type of weapon it was by looking at the bullet wounds or the bullet holes in the walls. In a defense zone, like in a war zone, defense analysts will do that with missile parts, or they'll do that with like watercraft or aircraft. There's various markers on those types of things that will tell us which nation it comes from. It will tell it which direction it was shot in. When the company I worked for in the past, we were covering a war zone in the Caucasus region in 2020. Some of the war propaganda that happened during that conflict, we had to verify like zones that there was ballistic shot. We couldn't verify what direction they were shot in. The defense analysis company would go in and he would investigate the ballistics and find what country it was shot from, like who actually shot it. I say all that to bring it back to why we have a policy and we have research on unidentified aerial phenomena in the defense space. We're really, with these policies, we're not talking about aliens. We're talking about the origin of assets in space. We're really looking into the policies that apply on Earth and Earth defense and Earth warfighting and pretty much all of the traffic that happens on the ground. A space lawyer will tell you that those policies on Earth, they also apply in the sky, in space. So these current annual reports, if we could scroll down a little bit, these are looking into the phenomenon where this reporting has not been able to identify these objects. So as there's more traffic that goes on in space, you're going to see a lot of governments trying to govern the assets and the different objects that are going through space. The origins, like why they're going where they're going. It's part of a process that on Earth in defense is called non-proliferation. So the word proliferation means the widespread use of weapons. Non-proliferation is trying to limit those widespread weapons. And so anything that applies to non-proliferation at the ground level would apply in space. So for example, like when I'm on vessels in the water, like when I'm like in a maritime space, I would want to identify where a ship is coming from. Like, is the ship that's approaching me on the water, is it from like a friendly country, or is it from like a foreign country that has a problem with my country and is going to start shooting at me? You see what I'm saying? And with national defense in space, that could be anything from an unmanned aerial vehicle, so like a drone, or like an unmanned small aircraft, like a little rocket ship. Here it says unmanned aircraft system in this document we have pulled up. I'm reading through it. Sorry, Michael. It's slowly scrolling, but basically we're using these policies, as silly as it sounds. Like it sounds like we're talking about it sounds like we're talking about aliens. We're using these policies to identify the traffic in space, like we do on the ocean, maritime policy, Arctic policy, those policies that govern spaces where no one country has full authority over the area. These policies are governing the sharing of global spaces and in space as it applies to Earth. So I hope that I didn't info dump in such a way that made no sense. If anybody would like to ask any questions, like I can help answer or clarify some of the things I just talked about. Michael, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I wanted to add, there's a piece in here about, so this is the takeaway from, I think it's kind of the most important paragraph. They had 366 newly identified reports. Now, it's interesting. We don't know what their backlog is. There's no way to know what the backlog of their reports are. So they might have, this has been a question. This goes back to the 70s, and I'm not a UFOologist or anything, but I remember a TV show called Project Blue Book, which I think was from the 70s and maybe even the 60s. So this has been around for a while, but they're only talking about 366 newly identified reports. So out of that, there's 6 that's basically clutter. They've got a pretty funny definition of clutter at the bottom: birds, weather, airborne debris like plastic bags. Okay, so that's 6. 26 is unmanned aerial systems. Okay, fine. Somebody's got a drone out in the wild. And then 163 characterized as balloons or balloon-like entities. Okay, so fine. So they have figured out that of the 366, they know what some of the stuff is. But it says 171 uncharacterized or unattributed. So, I take this as basically saying 12 pages to say we don't know. And that's cool. Great. I mean, it's interesting. But again, this is now a federal policy of research, which it was a hush-hush, can't talk about it, wink-wink, nudge-nudge kind of relationship to this idea for a really, really long time. And I'm not sitting here and advocating for it, but I determined a whole long time ago, long before my current team, that you can only be crazy about one project. And if we're crazy about building a lunar elevator, if we really think we can build a space elevator on the moon, then we don't talk about Bigfoot, we don't talk about the Loch Ness Monster, and we dang sure do not talk about UFOs, even though we get requests to talk about UFOs quite often. So this is the first time in a 20-year career that I'm even broaching the topic, and it's only because this is a new report and it's a new federal policy. So we're gonna move on. Rachel, did you have any other thoughts, or we're gonna move on?
No, I just want to clarify that unidentified flying object, unidentified vehicle, there can be a lot of reasons why it's not identified. So like when you compare it to naval or defense, sometimes sonar won't pick it up. Sometimes like the tech won't pick it up. Sometimes there's a malfunction in the system of the object approaching you and it doesn't identify itself according to policy. It sounds like we're talking about aliens, but that's not always the case. And I hope that clarifies some of the info dump from before.
Roger. Okay. And with that, we're going to move on. Thanks a lot, Rachel. Really appreciate that. I'm trying to stick to our schedule here. We're going to move on to kind of the core of our conversation, which is a different document. So let me pull that up here. And Rachel, I'm going to take you off camera now, okay? Okay. Bye. Okay, so again, we're sticking with the theme of policy here. There's a lot going on at the federal level. This is not policy. This document that we're about to look at is not policy. It is that precursor stage where a report was crafted. We'll talk about the who's and the whys in a moment. A report was crafted, and from that report, it may become policy. So it's in this netherworld of it's not quite policy, but it could become that. So, really important to kind of differentiate. The UAP report that was just issued, that's got policy, that's got a stamp of approval at the federal level. This one, if it moves up the food chain, it could become policy, but it's not currently. So again, I want to be really clear about where things are in the staging of all this. All right. So we're going to look at this document today. First, point out it's the. I got to change screen so I can see this. Give me a second. Everybody can see this okay? Good. Okay. Yeah, great. So this document here, it's one of the more interesting ones I've read in a little while. Leah, one of the, our co-founder on the team, was super excited about this one because okay, I just lost it. Give me a second. User error. Sorry about that. This document's really interesting. It's pretty unlike other documents that we've seen. And before we even dig into the document, I want to take you and have you just look at the graphics here. So what have we got? We've got a gas station. We've got opposable thumbs. I'm going to call it opposable thumbs. Basically one satellite that can grab onto another satellite. That's a really interesting graphic. It's an interesting choice of graphics here. So who put this thing together? So this is the Center for Space Policy and Strategy. It's at the Aerospace Corporation, and I've got friends of ours at the Aerospace Corporation. So this is Katrina Melograna did not write this document, but she's in the space policy group. She did that as an intern when she was at International Space University. She was an intern of Liftport back about 5 years ago. So that gal has done really well with her career. Really impressed by her. So, this is an organization that we really trust, and it's earned that trust because, and I'll post this link here in a moment. The Aerospace Corporation is a giant organization. They have 4,200 employees. They are basically the think tank of the Department of Defense, especially Space Force and Air Force. They have slightly more than 1,000 PhDs working at Aerospace Corp. So pretty cool organization, lots of smart people there. So when they write a document, it's got weight in the industry. It's got value in the industry. and that the way their process is a lot of smart people get together on this. I'm going to jump straight to the back because tons of references. Kurosawa Iwata is also an ISUer. He was actually in my class. So, this is the acknowledgement section, and some really smart people are involved there. And I'm going to spend some time at the back of this document before I finish with the front. So here's what we got. Enabling a new space paradigm, harnessing space mobility and logistics. I think that's kind of a terrible name. I don't know why every document that comes out of Washington, D.C. has to have such a terrible name, but that's what we got. It's brand new. It's only a few days old. And, the Aerospace Corporation's policy section is here. I just posted that to the chat a moment ago. When you think about 4,200 people, $1 billion in revenue, because it's a nonprofit, but it's got a lot of revenues for a nonprofit, and they keep 4,000 people employed, and a quarter of them are PhD specialists in their space field. Pretty remarkable organization. A lot of ISUers go there. I can think of at least 5 off the top of my head. One is the former dean of ISU, so it really does do some pretty amazing things. So, what is this document about? All right, this is very much a Space Force centric document, and we haven't really talked about Space Force before. I'm a big fan. I'm on record for being super supportive of it. I was involved at some super minor level, deep far in the background. Even at the end of the Obama administration, that's when Space Force was first presented. It was then appropriately named Space Corps, not Space Force. Names matter. Space Force has the wrong name. I'm still sticking with that. So I've been involved at a very minor level way back, almost 5 years now, before there was a Space Force. But this document is about Space Force, but it has giant implications to the whole global space sector. So there's now 5 space forces or space corps in the world. The U.S., China has always been a military organization, so I'm going to count that one. Britain and Australia are in the midst of creating one, and Israel's had one for a while. Oh, I guess there's 6 because France also has one. So, we were the first to stand it up, but it's also being followed by other organizations. So with that, before I go deep into this document, I want to show a few movies. It's movie time at DareGreatly. So let me stop sharing this and let me share. So first, I'm going to give a little bit of preamble. So there's 2 parts to this. There's U.S. Space Force, which this document is primarily focusing on, but there's also the Air Force component. So in the same way that the Marine Corps, U.S. Marine Corps, is subordinate to and a part of the United States Navy, U.S. Space Force is subordinate to and a part of U.S. Air Force. So I've got 2 quick movies here. Let me show them.
We depend on space every day to support our way of life, our supply chain, financial systems, weather tracking, and power grids, as well as air, land, and maritime infrastructure. Our U.S. military is the strongest and best equipped force in the world. In the heavily contested space domain, Space Systems Command leads a team of roughly 15,000 guardians, airmen, civilians, and contractors. Headquartered in El Segundo, California, our unbeatable team operates from multiple locations across the U.S. and includes 2 space launch deltas, SLD-45 at Patrick Space Force Base and SLD-30 at Vandenberg Space Force Base. Through unity of effort across the space acquisition enterprise, Space Systems Command delivers to warfighters integrated and resilient space capabilities through 5 program executive offices. Assured access to space, procures launch services and delivers on-orbit capabilities faster and more frequently than ever before, while sustaining ranges for the United States Space Force and commercial partners. Battle Management Command, Control, and Communication delivers tactical and operational command and control capabilities to warfighters, facilitating timely and quality battle space decisions for the joint all-domain fight. Space Domain Awareness and Combat Power maximizes the full characterization of space using a wide range of multi-domain assets by rapidly detecting potential and real threats to our nation and allies, which enables decisive action in the space domain. Communications and Positioning, Navigation, and Timing ensures the delivery of resilient capabilities across the acquisition lifecycle, from prototypes to systems on the production line to systems our warfighters have been operating for years. Space Sensing delivers space-based battle space awareness through missile warning, tracking, environmental monitoring, and tactical intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Our adversaries fully intend to disrupt, degrade, and destroy the U.S. and our allies' ability to access and operate in space. Not on our watch. Space Systems Command is focused on creating and sustaining resilient lethality in space through systems integration, unity of effort, and digital engineering ecosystems. At Space Systems Command, space starts here.
All right, so this is not, our channel is not a Space Force, Air Force propaganda recruiter channel. For the record, I'm a former U.S. Marine, so I certainly have some views on inter-service rivalry. That said, I'm a big fan of Space Force, and I think it would be pretty awesome to officially work for them. So that first video is the Air Force component, right? So it's kind of larger than Space Force. When they talked about Air Force Guardians, that's the name for spacers, Space Force people, Guardians, civilians. That's a total of about 15,000 people. Now, I'm going to share another video, which is admittedly a Space Force recruiting video. So just bear with me, take it for what it is. I still kind of like it, so I'm not going to be bashful about that. But I want you to see kind of the 2 different flavors. Ultimately, they have a lot to do in space. They have a lot to do in space. So sharing that.
Today, space is essential not only to our way of life, it's absolutely critical to the modern way of war. GPS, ATMs, cell phones, gas pumps, traffic lights, power grids, guided missiles, surveillance, RPAs, ground combat control. There's no such thing as a day without space operations. You just don't see them. Earth is only half the battle. Cyber attacks and jamming of our satellites. Microsatellites that can create a debris field. At 17,000 miles an hour, a piece of metal the size of a coin can be weaponized. Now is the time for a military branch with a clear and singular focus on space. A military branch that protects the hopes and dreams of America and our way of life as the space domain becomes more and more contested. It's time for another giant leap. The United States Space Force is being built from the brightest minds across the space operations of the Air Force, our joint services, and the private sector. We aren't just getting ready for the near future, we're getting ready for the 22nd century. When our enemies ask, what if? We will have an answer. When foreign powers can build bases on the dark side of the moon, when private companies are inventing a new economy beyond our planet, we need to stay one step ahead of the future. And the future is where we'll make history. We will fight in an environment with no up or down, no left or right, where there are no borders and nowhere to hide. Our Space Force is defending our country, here on Earth and wherever our mission takes us. As commerce and exploration expand, we will imagine the unimaginable, anticipate the inconceivable, and prepare for the impossible. We won't just think outside the box. We'll think outside the atmosphere, in one of the most challenging environments ever known.
Okay, so there's a lot of things I love about that video, and there's a lot of things I loathe about that video. I'm not gonna go into it. I could spend the entire hour dissecting that 3-minute video. One thing that's super clear to me is it was written by a propaganda marketing company. When they say the dark side of the moon, clearly no one at Space Force would say the dark side of the moon. That's the only rant you're going to get from me. I really like Space Force, but I could dissect this. I could dissect this video for an entire hour. I do love the fact that their ending clip is a space station that does not currently exist that has, variable gravity with an orbital system. So. I do like the idea that there will eventually be Space Force Guardians on orbit. I think that's super important. But with that, I'm going to not go on that rant. All right, so let me get it back to our core document here. And nope, that's not what I want. Sorry. I have a lot of tabs open, just bear with me. Okay, I'm going to bolt through this because we only have 15 minutes left. So this document is really all about how to make Space Force utilize the capabilities of the kind of American system of commerce and make Space Force better, and as a result, but not the primary driver, as a result, make commercial space better. I'm going to jump straight to the end because there's some things I want to highlight about why this document matters, and then I'll come back and dig into it a little bit. All right. The least optimal choice is to do nothing at all. Like, I love that that's their like closing sentence. While all of these items, all of these ideas within this document might be acceptable on some budget or time scale, commercial viability and application agnosticity, hate that word, placement proposed reflect the realities of the commercial demand and capabilities as well as unique DoD mission considerations. SM and L is required in order to transform the U.S. Space Force into a 21st century space warfighting force. So they're really upfront about what they're trying to do. And they want to make Space Force into a 21st century warfighting force. So like this document has some really specific applications. It should apply to both Space Force and US Spacecom. Those were the two videos that we just watched. And it's asking questions. How will the role of US Space Force relative to commercial providers change over time as the commercial market matures? One question. Another is, what acquisition strategies should be taken to balance enabling commercialization versus enterprise risk and resiliency? And finally, the last two questions: should policies and regulation change in order to better enable Space Force as a customer? I love that language. And then how should U.S. Space Force interact with industry on developing and defining critical interfaces? So those are the things I want you to be thinking about when we actually jump into the core of this document. So what are we talking about? There's things that we're going to do on orbit. But the first thing we got to understand is space mobility and logistics, SM and L. It's kind of a necessary piece of knowledge in this new space field. So recently, a couple weeks ago, we did a cislunar technology roadmap policy. A couple weeks before that, we talked about ISAM, in-space assembly and manufacturing. So this is another one, but this is really focusing on Space Force. And for the folks that were specifically asking for papers to read, boy, I can't tell you how much I stress reading this one. This space capstone publication for superpower called Superpower. I don't know if you can see my notes because they're really tiny on your screen, but my notes right here says imperative to read this. So I'm going to post that one. I think you will be very surprised when you read this document. This document is a change the world document, and I really can't stress that enough. The way you read this, whatever you read into it, I'd be real. I don't know who you are, but you're really, posting a lot. If you want to reach out and connect with me, I'm happy to do that. I'll post my LinkedIn connections. I'd be curious to find out, how you got here, what you're interested in, and these documents I think are super important. So I'm glad that you're interested in them. So then we're talking about what does space mobility and logistics encompass? It is capabilities meant to make spacecraft more maneuverable, adaptable, and resilient, including inspection, material logistics, orbit modification, refueling, client augmentation, and active debris removal. So we're going to go into this a lot more in a bit. Each of these things means money and research and development, and that R&D means product development, and that means new capabilities, new commercial capabilities, new military capabilities. So if you don't read anything other than this first page, make spacecraft more maneuverable, adaptable, and resilient, including inspection, material logistics, orbit modification, refueling, client augmentation, and active debris removal. If that's the only sentence that you read out of this whole document, you're ahead of 99% of the people in the space field. The next piece is understanding that Space Force is going to have to figure this out one way or another, and it's going to have to use kind of 4 basic approaches: as a participant in a wider market with standard services, or a strategic customer utilizing the wider market for customized services, or an anchor tenant for a capability with future commercial promise, or as a full owner of a unique capability. So those are the four, those are the four ways of looking at how Space Force is going to operate. And those are all true. I can promise you 100% from all the conversations I've been in, that is how this is going to be approached. Participant, customized, anchor tenant, or owner. And we're going to look at some boxes here in a minute. There are constraints to this, and everybody understands them. Policymakers and stakeholders are going to have to figure out how to adopt each piece here. Trying to move quickly here. Space mobility and logistics has recently been declared a core competency by U.S. Space Force. Read that document I just described, the Space Power One, that's all over in there. And it's got kind of actually seven, I've got a typo in here, 7 elements here. Rendezvous, proximity operations, docking, refueling, repair, and assembly. And there's another element, which is debris removal. So there is a way to make Space Force better by doing these things. There's a way as a commercial company that we can become clients or partners of record, programs of record with Space Force. So all of this stuff is happening. And the 4 approaches I just mentioned a minute ago, participant, customized, anchor tenant, or owner, are the ways that they are going to do these 7 things: rendezvous, proximity, docking, fueling, repair, and assemble. So kind of imagine a matrix of these 4 ways with these 7 requirements, right? Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. I'm going to read how they're going to do this, right? 4 approaches by which U.S. Space Force can mature space manufacturing and logistics capabilities. As a participant approach that becomes viable with wider commercial availability, a customized approach that relies on strategic partnership with vendors to adapt commercial development to government unique needs, as an anchor tenant approach for capabilities that have future commercial promise, and as an owner approach for capabilities that are neither commercially viable nor appropriate. So we're going to talk about these a little bit more, and they're broken down more in this document. I think it's an important document to read because they go into detail with these 4 areas that we don't have time to do tonight. But if Space Force is successful in implementing the sets of capabilities laid out under space mobility and logistics, that will be well positioned to protect and defend current and future U.S. global and in-space interests in a way that would be impossible without this new set of capabilities. Keep in mind, right, we don't know what the future of the U.S. and our allied partners looks like. We know that there's some rumblings in the invasion of Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We know that Belarus is considering deploying and attacking Ukraine. To me, that makes it the beginning of a world war. If you stop having 2 combatants and you have 3 combatants, at what point do you start declaring this a different kind of war? So we know that there are going to be global assets and global interests, and there are in-space assets and interests. We know that U.S. is going back to the moon. We've got allied partners doing that. There's going to be a requirement for new capabilities. So this is a way for Space Force to get ahead of some of those requirements. I particularly love this quote attributed to General Pershing. Infantry wins battles, logistics wins wars. For those that don't know, my military specialty, my MOS was 0431 in the Marine Corps. It's a logistics and embarkation specialist. I've been learning about logistics since I was 18 years old. And I'm a big believer that logistics win or lose wars. Tactics, with the available logistics material provided, win skirmishes, right? If you win enough skirmishes, you probably win the war. So I'm all about logistics. And if that means making space logistics better, then that's what we're going to do. With just a few more minutes left, there's doctrine out there that's super important. We don't talk a lot about doctrine, but when they say by the book, doctrine is the book that we're talking about. And I always laugh when I'm watching Mandalorian, because when he says this is the way, that's doctrine. That's the way things are done, is doctrine. And there's a lot that goes there's a lot that goes into that. Now, there are kind of 7 elements of sustainability that S, M, and L help reinforce. Replenishing consumables, replenishing expendables, they're not the same thing. Spacecraft inspection, anomaly resolution, systems maintenance, systems upgrade, and orbital recovery. Those are the things, added with the stuff we talked about a minute ago, that space mobility and logistics is trying to give the DoD and Space Force capabilities, is trying to build out those capabilities. We talked a minute ago at the beginning about energy, power in space is power in space. It really comes down to propellant. I'm not going to get into that. I hope everybody knows about that. But propellant's a life-limiting factor for all spacecraft. Spacecraft cannot move without it. Traditionally, propellant was one of the greatest contributions to weight, constraining all of the spacecraft's other functions. Because of that, propellant was limited to a minimum needed for its intended life. So it was always a trade-off between what can you do and how long can you do it. This story is funny. You should all read it. It's worth the effort. I want to point out, keeping on time here, these are the service areas that we're talking about: inspection, material logistics, orbit modification, refueling, client augmentation, debris mitigation. Those are the missions that Space Force is going to be looking for partners on. And partners are going to look like this. Is it an anchor tenant? Is the DoD a participant? Along for this kind of commercial viability line, if you're low versus if you're high, and then application agnosticity, is this really only a DoD thing, or can commercial users use this service? And I love this chart. I really like this chart. I will say that commercial viability, if you've got DoD as an anchor tenant, you are more likely to raise the capital to move you from this quadrant to this other quadrant. So that's something worth thinking about. It's not me saying that the authors are wrong. I think that there's another element that doesn't matter to their audience, to the DoD audience, but does matter to organizations like ours at Liftport. And with that, I'm going to tell you that there's a ton of stuff in here. They go a lot deeper into these various elements. I think that's what we've got. All right, so I'm going to close this off and close out our show. Give me a second. Okay. Before we close, I want to point out that we've got Sean Mahoney, the former CEO of Maston Aerospace, and the current president of the Space Frontier Foundation on Monday. I think that's going to be a super great conversation. He's a really smart guy. He's got years and years and years of experience in the space sector. So he's going to be super fun to talk to. Peter Garrettson's going to be a part of this show. I think in the following week. And I wanna do a shout out to my team because of course they're awesome. Taylor in the background is going to be doing audio editing and creating a database. Jen, who's doing some terrific work on her database, and we'll be starting to work on maybe designing some space assets. So super excited about that. Yusuf doing our YouTube videos. Leah always terrific work from her, whether it's creating, being in the background, creating our websites or imagery, or just being a rock that I can lean on. Thanks a lot, Rachel, for being a part of our show tonight. It's always fun doing this, and it goes by so fast. So with that, I really appreciate everybody being a part of this. Definitely consider buying a ticket to our Dare Greatly event at the end of March. And please come back. We're going to do this every Monday and Tuesday for the whole year. So that's 100 really interesting conversations. So thanks, everybody, for being a part of this. I'm going to post my link to LinkedIn because I'd really like to chat with what's your name? Hone? Go in. I'd really like to chat with you. So let me just get my stay for like 10 more seconds while I get you my LinkedIn connection. I'd really like to chat with you if you don't mind. That's me. Capture that link quickly because I have to close off the show, and I need to, like, that link's going to go away. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate that. I like your comments. I'll review them in a minute. And with that, terrific show. Thanks a lot, people. Appreciate it. Bye.